Well, look what showed up at my front door. It's a big block Chevy. It's Ducky's big block Chevy. And before we get into the meat of things, let me bring you up to speed on what's going on with him. So if you remember, around Christmas time, we started talking about his 66 Impala and how we were going to do a big block, a little squirt of nitrous, and he wanted to do like a drift car out of it, and this was going to be an ongoing project. So, make a long story short, right after we shot that, maybe a week or two after we shot that, he was on his way home from the shop, which is my next door neighbor here, and about a half mile up the road, going around a blind turn, he ended up T-boning a delivery driver. He was making a crazy U-turn where he shouldn't have been making a U-turn. So it was a pretty bad accident. How bad of an accident was it? Ducky died. Ducky got killed in the accident, and they revived him. He went to the light, they brought him back. So he ended up in the hospital, in and out of comas and all kinds of surgeries and stuff like that. Pretty severe head injury. He was in there for quite a while. So he got out of the hospital and he brought me over all of the top end stuff for the engine, cylinder heads and all the pistons and all of that. And then he disappeared. And I was like, what happened to Ducky? Another accident? I guess the near-death experience made him like want to go home. He's from England, so he went back to England for like a month, and then he came back. So now he's all back to normal and all recovered, and he brought me the block yesterday, so the builders are going to continue. And at the end of this video, I'll give you the details on that, what the tentative plan is. Remember, we've already had 2 tentative plans, now we're going to have a 3rd tentative plan. But that's not what this video is about. I want to talk about comparing the kings, because this is an unusual situation, because right here we have the 2 undisputed kings of American internal combustion engines. We've got the big block Chevy and the 426 Hemi, the big block Mopar / 426 Hemi. And what I thought would be really neat, because I have never seen this comparison done, a direct side by side, not in any of the old magazines, not in any YouTube videos or anything like that, but actually the 2 engines, the core of the engines, side by side and compared. They are the undisputed kings. And to this day, 60, almost 70 years after they were first released, I guess is the core engine, not the evolution, but the essence of these engines is still intact. The top fuel dragster is still based on the 426 Hemi and its general characteristics. And the quickest and fastest, the most powerful, normally aspirated cars, and a lot of blown cars too, are based on the Chevy. So let's look at the core of these engines. Let's see where they came from and get right down deep into the guts of them and see what makes them tick. So now, okay, so I know you Ford guys, you're like, he hates Fords. Yeah, look, I'll add in Ford stuff as we go along where it makes sense. And all right, we'll get to all of that. All right. So, what do these 2 engines have in common, besides being extremely well-engineered pieces of machinery? They were both conceived and designed in the middle 1950s. They were both released in their original form in 1958. So in 1958, Chrysler released the B motor, so the 350 and 361, which was a low deck version of this. But the basic configuration was the same. 1958. The 1959, the taller deck versions, the 413, and then later on the 426 wedge, and later on the 426 Hemi, and then later on the 440, all came afterwards. But the original layout was B engine. The big block Chevy, on the other hand, was originally released in 1958 as the W motor. It was a 348 cubic inch motor, and then they went to the larger size, which was the 409. Now, the top end of the engines, the deck and the cylinder heads, are completely different than what you see here. But we're talking about the guts of the engine, the basic foundation that all of this power is made from and everything evolved from. So, while the top end is completely different, the bottom end of the 348 and then the 409 and then later the 427 and all that is this. This is what it's based on. And to this day, you get a Chevy race block it's nearly identical in configuration to what you see here. So, although they originally had 2 bolt mains, these were, let's not even go there yet. So this was originally released in 1958 as a 348, then later the 409, and then in 1963 they developed what they called the Daytona Mystery Motor. So that was the Z11, or the Porcupine engine, and that's what the contemporary big block Chevy we know today is. So the original motors, the W motors, had a really crazy combustion chamber. So the combustion chamber wasn't in the head like every other engine. The combustion chamber was actually in the piston. The piston had a big dish in it, and then the cylinder head was completely flat. In 1963, for racing, Chevy engineers developed what we know now as the big block Chevy head and stuck it on that block. They straightened out the decks, and they used, or they cut the decks in a more conventional fashion, and they put those porcupine heads on there. So that was the 1963 Z11. Now, the thing about that engine, where it's significant as far as Chrysler goes, is that that is the engine that forced Chrysler to put the 426 Hemi heads, or adapt the Hemi heads to the wedge block. So these two engines have a symbiotic relationship early on. One led to the development of another. Now, let's talk about the Ford for a second, because the Ford, the engine that Ford was using at this period of time was the FE in all of its various configurations and cubic inches. So the FE doesn't really fit into this picture, because the FE, its evolution really stopped at that point. Actually, the evolution of the FE, by the time these things developed into the 426 Hemi and the rat motor as we know it today, the FE was at the end of its life cycle. They went to the camera. I know, I got all these camera people, camera. The bottom end of the engine, the core of the engine, what we're examining here, was way inferior and not up to the task. If you look at an FE motor has much narrower main saddles. The oil holes in them are offset. The oil system to the bottom end is very unorthodox. And actually they had to use a side oiler system. They had to add an oil passage to the side of the block to actually compensate for all of that. The FE, when you compare an FE to, let's say, a big block Chrysler, the main saddles are like potato chips. Everything is undersized. And that's why to this day, you do not find FE-based ultra power engines. You do find Boss 429 based engines, which are based on the Lima block, and the Lima block is basically a reconfiguring of the big block Chevy. So that's where that fits in. But again, we're going to focus on just these two because they're the last word in internal combustion engine. So that's where they came from. That was their basic evolution that brought them to their current state, or the state that we know them today, that you can buy these things brand new today from all different manufacturers. And they're true to these basic configurations. Although the ones you buy today, the Chevys, are much, much closer to what was originally designed in 1958 than the Chrysler. And we'll get into all of that. So, their oiling systems, because these were originally designed as passenger car engines, hydraulic lifters, they're lifter priority oil engines, which means that in this configuration, the lifter galley, the oil pumps feed the lifter galleys directly, and then the mains are fed from that. So they get the lifters get the oil first, then the bottom end. Later race versions of it did away with that. So later race versions clearly or obviously feed the crankshaft first, and most of them don't have any oil passages to the lifters at all. They're just oiled by splash. But that's how these engines were originally laid out. The Chrysler has a more generous oiling system. So the basic map of the oiling is really the same on both of these engines. The main difference being that the pump is mounted out front on the 426 and it's mounted out back on the Chevy. But the the way it oils the various passages in the engine are pretty much identical. You can see these are factory size holes, oil feed holes to the mains on the Chrysler compared to the Chevy, which are about a third smaller. The Chrysler takes its thrust from number 3, and the Chevy takes thrust from number 5. And that's kind of important from a strength standpoint, because the undercut for the thrust bearing at the number 3 Chrysler is a liability, because this is the weakest part of the block. This is the important part you got to protect right here. So the fact that it narrows up for the thrust on the number 3, it's not optimum. The thrust at number 5 is perfect on this. So now let's talk about the differences in configuration. So you got to understand, when these engines were originally conceived, they had no idea that anybody could get the kind of power that we would be getting out of these things 70 years later. Back in those days, when these engines were designed, the thought of getting over 1,000 horsepower out of a normally, out of a production-based engine was unheard of. And both of these engines, in the form that we're looking at them right here, made well over 2,000 horsepower in, let's say, the last days of iron-top fuel engines, 1971, 1972, 1973. They were up in the 2,000 horsepower range, exactly the way you see them now. 2,000 horsepower doesn't seem like a lot these days, but back in 1972, 1973, it was crazy. So, but that's what these were capable of before they evolved completely into their race configuration. So like I said, when they designed these engines, the kind of power that we talk about today wasn't even thought of. Chrysler engineers, they went a little fancy on this. These engines are actually complete polar opposites when it comes to the design of the bottom end. Chrysler engineers wanted to get fancy. They used the deep skirt like the Ford motor, like the FE and the Y block before that. They used a deep skirt motor because they wanted a solid, quiet engine. By eliminating the pan, the deep oil pan that would run like all over here, oil splashing against the pan, that tinny sound was eliminated. They didn't do this for strength. They did this to make a more solid feeling and sounding engine, like exactly the way Ford did. Now, because they wanted a deep skirt over here, instead of putting a lot of beef around the important part of the block, what's important to us today, the weak part, they hadn't gotten to that point in terms of evolution. So there wasn't a lot of concern given to strength in this main saddle area. And this is the weak link of any high output hot rod engine. This is where things break. So instead of just throwing a bunch of cast iron in there, they designed in a bunch of ribs and gussets that kind of tie this all together and keep everything straight. Now, these cross bolts weren't added until 1964 when they put the Hemi heads on here. But what you're looking at here is essentially the same exact thing as a 440, a 383 or 440, any big block Chrysler, minus the cross bolts. So the cross bolts were added in 1964 because for NASCAR consideration, extended, extremely high RPM operation, the caps would walk around. And so to keep the caps from walking around, they added these cross bolts. These are only 3/8 bolts. They're 3/8 coarse bolts that go in here. They don't do anything to support the main saddle. They just keep the cap from moving around. So that's why these were added. But at any rate, this is the weak point on any Chrysler engine, on any big block Chrysler or Hemi engine. It's this area between the cam and the crank. And where they crack is right exactly here. Actually, usually it's number 2. The number 2 main will crack right exactly where I'm running my finger over here. You got a crack that starts there, and then you can see where it's undercut. Look at the amount of undercut that's here. Look at my finger and how far in it goes. And that's where the crack happens. So then the crack goes above this bolt boss right here, and then it spreads and goes up the cylinder wall. And that's universally how these things break when they break. It'll usually break number 2 and number 4. These are the most common ones to break. Then number 3, and when you break enough of them, the block just splits in half. The crank stays, in the car, and the top of the engine gets yeeted into, the atmosphere. Completely separates. So not a lot of beef. There's a lot of design, there's a lot of structure, but not a lot of beef. Now Chevy, on the other hand, their engineers were like, screw it, just make big molds and pour a bunch of metal in there. That's what they did, and that's what you got here. There is no consideration, there's no room or consideration for 4-bolt mains, straight down 4-bolt mains on a big block Chrysler. But on the Chevy, you've got this giant bulkhead right here that accepts the 4-bolt main, which helps support this part of the block, the weak part of the block, the saddle. The pan rail here is thick. This is just the way they were sent from the factory. And the thing about this is that these engines, this design transferred, there's so much beef here that this design transferred directly to aluminum without any modifications. The factory aluminum block, the ZL1, and then later race engines. It's all pretty much exactly the way Chevy engineers first designed it. Lots of beef. So we showed the undercut here where they crack on the Chrysler, but if we go to the same area on the Chevy, you've got, well, right there in that area, there's no undercut. There is some undercut here, but this whole area is much, much beefier. No comparison. There's no comparison between the Chrysler and the Chevy as far as that goes. In the later part of the Top Fuel days, 1972, 1973, there were several Chevys running at the time. Now, a hitter Chrysler car, one that was going to, like a national event contender that was going to go around, these guys would only get 3, 4, 5, 6 runs out of a block before it would split the mains. And Chrysler even released a special block with thicker mains, and it would still break those. The Chevy, on the other hand, those guys never had problems with the blocks. They had detonation issues. Those engines would rattle themselves to death, but there was never any problem with the crank and the block. That all stayed structurally perfect, but they'd blow out cylinder walls and melt pistons and shatter rods and do all that kind of damage, but never any problem as far as keeping the crank in place. So the Chevy did have a superior, from the get-go, design as far as that goes. Again, back to the Ford's, potato chips. The main saddles are made out of potato chips. Don't delude yourself, okay? All right. Now, in later incarnations of the 426, this actually became much more like the Chevy. So when Milodon in 1973, Milodon introduced the first aluminum 426 Hemi block. And it was the Milodon 7-liter. And what's interesting about that is that the core of the block, the basic core of the block, was a Chevy. So in other words, it looked just like this. The difference was, instead of having a separate pan rail, it had a girdle, a separate bolt-on girdle that went all the way around. So when the engine was assembled, it looked like this, but it was actually this. The pan rail went right to the center line of the main caps. You can see on the Chrysler, it doesn't come to the center line of the caps. Okay, so here's the bottom of the water jacket, and look over here. The cap actually hangs out below it. I know it's upside down, but the cap is actually below. The center line is below the beefiest part of the block, or the main part of the block. Where you see on the Chevy, it's actually right there in line. So the Milodon 7-liter did exactly this. The Milodon 7-liter looks exactly like a Chevy, and then it has a full-size bolt-on girdle that fits around and holds all the caps in place. Problem with that was servicing the engine. It didn't last very long, because in order to get to the mains, you had to undo this whole thing, as opposed to, on a Chevy or even a street Hemi based block, you couldn't just pop the mains. You had to take the whole girdle apart. So it wasn't until the following year that Keith Black came along with his version of the engine, and again, the bottom end of it was beefed like the Chevy, and it had the extended pan rails, and that was the beginning of the evolution of the aluminum 426 Hemi. But again, the Chevy, the evolution of the aluminum Chevy hasn't changed. Like, its configuration looks the same. Now, when you come to the latest versions of the 426, they reduced this pan rail, okay? So you can see right here, I know there's some cosmetic damage right here. It's not a big deal. But they shorten this distance from here to about here. They run the cross bolts in a little bit lower, bigger cross bolts, and like I said, they lowered the pan rail, because by shrinking this down, you make the whole assembly a little bit more rigid. And they made it a little bit wider also to make it easier to service. So, but again, you look at a modern top fuel, Hemi block, and you can see this configuration. I'm trying to think what else there was to cover on these. Yeah, it's a damn good question. I can't think of anything else to cover on them. I think I hit all of the high points. But that's basically those two engines side by side. The most potent factory production engines really ever produced, and I don't think anything will ever top these, because again, 1958, this is 20 or 25, so you're talking about almost 70 years. It's 70 years since the designers first drew these things out, right? With slide rules and stuff. There was no computer aided assembly, no computer aided design when these were pencils and rulers and all that. And the guys who sat down to design these things 70 years ago and then put them into production, in 1958, had no idea that these engines would be taken to the levels that they exist at today. Truly engineering marvels. And this is like real gearhead nerd stuff. Like, this isn't the kind of knowledge that like makes your life, is gonna make you a Superman. But it's like, it's the essence, gearhead nerd stuff. This is the kind of thing I absolutely love. I'm trying to think if there's anything I didn't cover. Dimensionally, okay, we can talk about dimensions for 1 second. The Chryslers are 4.800 bore, and the Chevy is a 4.840. So the Chevy has a 40 thousandths of an inch wider bore spacing. Makes the block a little bit longer end to end. And that's never changed among these engines. The deck heights came and went, and deck configurations on the Chevy came and went, so we won't even go into that. Both of these engines have 5 bolt per cylinder as far as head bolts, ceiling. And the Chrysler cap is about, the Chrysler main saddle is about 30 thousandths of an inch wider than the Chevy. But all right, I could still keep going on with this, and I don't want to go on with this. The video is already 23 minutes long. I'm sorry if I'm boring you. Gearhead nerd stuff. I get into this type of thing. Back to Ducky, and back to Ducky's Chevy over here. Okay, so here's tentative plan. We talked about this yesterday. It's another tentative plan because we've already done tentative plan 1 and tentative plan 2. So here's tentative plan 3, right? Ducky is going to put together a work team. All right, he's going to come up with a couple of people, and we're going to do like a Sunday work party here, right? Because I have too many things going on for me to dedicate too much time to this on my own. Ducky's running business up there, same thing with him. So what we're going to do is he's going to put together a work team, a couple of people. I don't know who they are yet, and we're going to get together every Sunday and have like a work party on this thing. Get the old motor out, get the car prepped, get all of these parts ready to go, all the assembly, put it together and get it running. If tentative plan number 3 holds out, we should be able to get this thing up and running by the end of the year. I don't know. I got my fingers crossed, but we'll see how it goes. You never know how it's going to go with Ducky. All right, so that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed our little this is really gearhead nerd stuff. You've got to be damaged to really appreciate this type of thing. I'll see you tomorrow.